Carpetbaggers by Koufax. Chapter 10. There was, naturally, another party. Lucy danced with her brothers and with Torvis and Bindle, who was surprisingly light on his feet for a dwarf, and in a great circle with beach girls and elm girls circling about a bonfire in the field in front of the castle gates. The music was mostly drumming by the Dryads and the Centaurs, but some of the dwarves and fauns had flutes and pipes in their packs, which gave the night a sweet, high, wild sound that seemed to spiral up into the stars, so thickly scattered across the black velvet sky. She awoke with her head on Raya's flank, the morning sun hot on her face, and a magpie bouncing eagerly at her feet.
"Queen! Queen! There are raiders coming, Queen!"
said the magpie, and then bounced back into the air, presumably to pass the word along. Lucy rubbed her eyes and looked around. She had not even made it into the castle yesterday, and had slept on a bed of green boughs in the shelter of the castle walls, far enough from the bonfire to avoid being trampled in the darkness. Truth be told, she didn't remember falling asleep, and decided that Peter or Susan must have put her to bed. She wasn't the only one outdoors, though. There were bundled sleepers across the lawns, and the only waking soul she saw was the yawning gate guard and the magpie skimming over the ramparts. "Raya!" Lucy said, and nudged the wolf. "Someone's coming!" Raya sat up, blinking.
"You're right," she said, cocking an ear. "Horses, I think. I hear that tack jingling. We should wake the High King."
But they found Peter already in the courtyard, buckling on his sword. "Ahead!" he said before Lucy had the chance to say anything. "Let's meet them outside." But before they went through the gate again, he stopped Lucy and picked some grass out of her hair. "I hope it's not anyone important," he said, brushing at his own wrinkled tunic. "We look like we've been sleeping in ditches."
"Well, we have!"
burst out Lucy, laughing, and he grinned back at her, looking not at all like a warrior king. The riders came into view just then, a company of about 20 men and women in green, with a centaur in the rear.
"Oh, it's Sir Paradin!"
Lucy cried, and ran out through the gates to greet them. "Your Majesty!" cried Sir Paradin, and dismounted with far more grace than Lucy or her siblings had been able to exhibit. Despite the weariness on his face, he dropped to one knee before her and swept off his helmet. "You honor us with your welcome."
Lucy giggled,
Although she knew Paradin was entirely sincere. He was always sincere, even when she had first met him standing in the dark road and tumbling words out about the brigands and Peter and Susan and Aslan and Edmund and dragons. He had not laughed or belittled her, but had believed her every word. They had gone on together, Lucy riding behind him through the night, and had rescued Peter and Susan, although she had to be fair and admit that Edmund and the wyvern had helped too, and the dwarves had freed themselves. About them, sleeping revelers began to rise, including the giant Rumblemuffin, who had been prone in a ditch. When he stood up, several of the Archenlanders jumped, and one of the horses, weary as it was, tried to run away. Its rider was dragged some distance, clinging to its bridle before he was able to bring it under control. Peter extended a hand and lifted Sir Paradin to his feet. "You are always welcome at Cap Paravel, Sir Paradin, although honestly I don't know how much hospitality we can offer. There wasn't much in the way of supplies when we left."
"Oh, that doesn't matter, Peter,"
said Lucy, and led the way into the castle. "We have plenty of room after all, and we can always go fishing for supper like we did before." Paradin exchanged a few words with the Archenlander centaur, and then followed Lucy and Peter into the great hall. Fishing?" he asked tentatively. But Susan and Edmund met them then, and in the fuss about getting breakfast out on the east balcony, no one ever answered Paradin's question. There was a teapot on a small table on the balcony, and just as Lucy sat down on the bench next to it, a small figure in a blue dress approached, carrying a tray.
"Panna!"
cried Lucy, leaping to her feet again. And then there were hugs and introductions, and Lucy tried to tell Paradin about how Susan had saved Panna's father, but Susan wanted to pour the tea, and Edmund kept handing around the honey cakes, and Lucy decided she would have to tell the story later. Panna took the empty tray with her and left, announcing that she would be back soon with breakfast. Edmund looked immeasurably cheered at this.
"She's been here for days,"
announced Susan, with some asperity, and finally began to pour the tea. "She even brought some supplies with her, Lord knows how. We'll have to figure out how to pay for it. And her." Then she looked at Paradin and blushed. "I'm sorry, Sir Paradin, we haven't exactly settled in yet." He smiled as he took his tea from her. "The castle has been empty for 100 years, Your Majesty. Of course there are going to be some complications." Speaking of complications, Peter hadn't touched his tea nor his honey cake. Did you see the princess on the road? Peregrine nodded, and his earnest smile faded. She claimed she was headed to Anvad, and as I have no authority over her, I was forced to take her word for it. If she goes astray, well, at least one of the men she took has more loyalty to me than she knows, and I'll hear about it. I do not envy her the reception His Majesty her brother will give her in Anvar, though. I received word from him just yesterday, and he was most wroth.
Well, she deserved to be punished,
said Lucy, affronted. Eluned had been very rude indeed. If Lucy had spoken like that to anyone, she would have been sent to bed without her supper. And she had tried to become queen, even though Aslan had quite clearly crowned them. Peregrine shook his head. I do not think she will be punished, valiant queen. She is, after all, the king's sister, and he loves her well despite her wildness. Or maybe because of it, he added, looking thoughtful. But she will be shamed for having embarrassed King Lune in Aslan's eyes. And yours, your majesties. And for failing, asked Edmund. He had bits of honey cake on his lips, but his eyes were narrowed. Ed, said Peter warningly, but Peregrine raised a hand. No, your majesty, it is a fair question. King Edmund, he said, looking at Edmund directly. I cannot know King Lune's mind, but I can tell you that he has always been an honest and fair-dealing man. Aslan is venerated in Arkenland as he is in Narnia, and it is clear to any with eyes to see that the lion has acted here. I will stake my life on it as I have staked my honor. King Lune desires only your goodwill and friendship, and that Narnia and Arkenland be brothers in future, as they were in the long years past, ever since Prince Gold came south to the mountains. Edmund looked at Peregrine for a long moment, and Lucy saw Susan exchange an uneasy glance with Peter. But then Edmund nodded, still not smiling. And that's what you came to say, wasn't it? Giving our speech to smooth over the mess your princess made?
At! Susan said, her voice sharp. That's enough. Sir Peregrine is our guest.
Peter lifted the teapot threateningly. And it's breakfast! No more politics until after lunch, Ed, and that's an order. Or what? Asked Edmund, but he looked satisfied. Lucy sighed and took another bite of her honey cake. She didn't like the sort of argument where everything meant more than the words said. Or I'll send you out to spa with Rumblebuffin, said Peter, and as Lucy burst into giggles, Panna came back with a platter full of fruit, grilled fish, and soft white rolls. After breakfast, Lucy went off to the kitchens to talk with Panna, and Susan disappeared upstairs saying something about chambers and linens, which struck Edmund as unlikely, but then Susan seemed able to find things in the castle no one else could. This left Edmund, Peter, and Peregrine on the sunlit balcony with the cooling tea and pitiful remains of the best meal any of them had eaten in weeks.
King,
said Rhea, and Edmund jumped a little. She had been dozing in the sun while they ate, and he'd forgotten she was there. Now she was standing in front of Peter, looking a little uncomfortable.
Do I have your leave to go?
Go where? Asked Edmund. She didn't look at him, but still watching Peter, she said,
My pack has been without me for some time, King. I would see my pups again before the winter comes.
Edmund's jaw dropped. Pups. All this time, and she had never said anything. And they had never asked either. Peter was more circumspect, or perhaps he had known, because his expression didn't change. He did, however, kneel down and put his arms around her neck. Rhea sniffed at his hair and licked him once on the neck. Go, he said, his voice thick. Take all the time you need for your family, and if they are willing, bring them back with you. May the lion travel with you. There was a sound Edmund had never heard from Rhea. It sounded like a whine, and then in silence she bowed to both brothers and disappeared down the stairs. The sound of her nails on the flagstones had died away before Peregrine stirred and said, That is a most worthy vassal, King. She deserves better than raw meat and a bed by the fire, said Edmund, and then he paused, thinking about that. You know, we shouldn't either. Could we? Asked Peter. He looked startled by the notion, as if it hadn't occurred to him that he had that power. Peregrine shrugged. We have no lady knights in Arkenland, but this is Narnia, and if any female deserves the honor, it is she for the loyal service she has rendered. Peter nodded, but he didn't sit down again. Instead, he went to the railing and looked down into the garden below. "Speaking of loyal service," he said, turning back around and leaning against the railing, "tell me about Telmarine mercenaries." This was a sudden change in topic. "What are you talking about, Pete?" What did Peter know that he hadn't told Edmund? Peter ignored Edmund and raised an eyebrow at Peridin, who looked a bit confused. "What do you need to know, Your Majesty?" "Who are they? Are they a major power in the region? What can I expect from them in the future?" Peter had evidently been thinking about this a great deal, but then he'd spent a lot of time with them. All the same, Edmund was just as glad Susan wasn't here for this conversation. The memory of Asper was still vivid in his mind. Peridin turned his teacup around on the table, frowning. "I don't know all the answers to your questions, High King, but I will tell you what I can. Although, forgive me, but I have been on the road for 3 days with little rest, and if I sit here much longer, I shall fall asleep. Could we walk while we speak?" So they went up to the ramparts of the castle, stopping now and then to consider the view or discuss the defensibility of a particular angle. Peridin told them in fits and starts of how several years ago Archenland began to suffer from a series of small but vicious attacks in its western territories. "We didn't even know who they were, you see. The villages in western Archenland are poor and isolated, mostly living on their herds in small mountain valleys. The raiders would attack at night, steal or kill the cattle, and burn the halls. Over time they grew more bold, and last year they attacked the holding of Earl Dan of Shadowvale. The Earl fought them off with minor losses, but he captured 3 of them, and thus we learned who they were." "Telmarines," said Edmund. "Yes, but we don't know why. We have some trading with Talmar, but we pose no threat to them. We are content within our own borders. And Talmar, you may not know, but the country is fractured and divided. The last king of Talmar died many years ago before I was born, and since then the various tribes and cantons have each had their own lords and barons squabbling over small portions of the whole. There is in truth no country of Talmar anymore, just Telmarines, all fighting for anything they can get." Peridin sighed and thumped a closed fist against the stone rampart. "It's a shame, for it was a rich land and many people lived there. They could be a great power, even a counterweight to Calormen, if they could but find a single leader to guide them." "On the mercenaries?" asked Peter, leading them further on towards the entry to the north tower. Peridin nodded. He looked as exhausted now as he had claimed, as if the very topic were draining him of vitality. "There are many landless men and women now as a result of the wars there, and so they hire out their swords to one of a dozen major companies and twice as many smaller ones. I do not know that I would not do the same if, lying forbid, King Lune died and my family lost our lands. What else have I to offer but my strong right arm?" They followed Peter up 3 flights of steps onto the top of the tower. The sun was just as bright up here, and from the top Edmund could see people down in the courtyard. One of them was a centaur, and he guessed that it was Windcaller, perhaps talking with members of the newly established castle guard. He turned back to the others. "So there are Telmarine mercenaries all over then?" he said. "Not just in Telmar, or in Archenland." "Oh, indeed, King Edmund. There are few great lords from Ferelin to Galma who have never hired any Telmarines, and Asper of Rose Island is one of the most renowned. But he has, I admit, a less honorable reputation than some." A look of distaste crossed Peridin's face. "And if the White Witch offered him Calamine coin to stir up trouble in Archenland, he would have taken it?" Peter offered this as a statement, not a question. "Certainly," said Peridin promptly. Then his interest turned to astonishment. "Wait, are you saying... Your Majesty, is that what happened?" "You didn't know?" said Peter, frowning. He was shorter than Peridin, and slighter. He still looked like a boy by comparison. But he had an air of authority about him now that hadn't been there when they'd all got on the train to go to the country. It didn't seem to occur to Peridin to question him. Peridin struck his hand on the railing. "Aslan's mane, no! We would never have suspected the witch. Narnia's borders have been closed since before my grandfather was born, Your Majesty. No one goes in, and very little comes out. In fact, I don't think anyone outside Narnia has even seen the witch herself in 50 years. "But Eluned knew," Peter said, speaking slowly, almost reluctantly. "She knew who had been paying Asper. She said it outright. Something about the Telmarines foraging into Narnia because they'd lost their employer. She probably thought it didn't matter, the witch was gone, and I was, as she thought, just a peasant boy. It didn't matter what she said to me." Edmund watched as the realization came upon Peregrine. What it meant, if what Peter said was true. The fair skin flushed under its summer tan, and then the eyes hardened. It was possible suddenly to believe that this earnest young man could lead soldiers into battle. Peregrine straightened, and his left hand clenched about the hilt of his sword. "Your Majesty," he said quite formally, "I fear I must take my leave. I have an urgent errand to Anvard that cannot stay on courtesy." Peter nodded, then strode forward and clasped Peregrine's hand. "Go with my deepest gratitude and most courteous greetings for your king. Please tell him that I am grieved by this intelligence, and I hope that we may meet soon." And in a moment, with a flutter of his cloak and a clatter of spurs, Peregrine was gone. The sun shone bright across the top of the tower, the turrets casting shadows in such neat lines it looked like a chessboard. Edmund looked at the doorway through which Peregrine had disappeared, and at the gulls circling above the beach, and then at Peter, who seemed lost in thought. "What will they do to her?" Edmund asked finally. Peter shrugged. "I've no idea. Could be she only just found out after all. But if she's known for long, well..." Peter finished the thought, thinking out loud. "If she's known for long, then she might have been in on it. She was in communication with someone, and thought she stood to gain by it. Maybe she thought the fighting would draw him out, and he would get himself killed. Maybe she reckoned destabilizing the country would give her a chance at the throne. Maybe she didn't think at all." It was an ugly thought that Eluned had sacrificed her own people, or been willing to have others kill them, just to stir up trouble. Was it worse than betraying your siblings and relative strangers out of petty malice? Or was it just the same? He ought to feel some sympathy for Eluned. Edmund knew that Aslan would expect no less of him. But instead he just felt queasy as he thought of King Lune and Lune's young sons, who might never know their aunt now. And of course there were so many others who had died as well. The Telmarines must have killed many Archenlanders in their raids. "I was different," something inside him whispered. "We're not the same." And yet, Aslan had died, and so many others had died during the battle. A warm hand gripped his shoulder, and Peter shook him gently. "You're not hurt, Ed. We've got enough burdens of our own without looking out for others to carry." "Right," said Edmund a little shakily, and then took a deep breath. It was a beautiful day, and they were home at Carpetbaggers, all safe and sound. They were building a nation out of winter's wreckage, and he was, remarkably, after everything, a king. "So, you were saying something about sparring? Think Silvershop can give us an hour?"
She would not have thought that being a queen would have required so many lists.
Certainly none of the queens in fairy tales ever seemed to worry about inventories and supply orders and payroll. They just danced and sang and married well. She hesitated, one end clutching a stubby bit of charcoal, and then shook her head. Time enough to worry about that later, and there was still England after all. By contrast to those queens of legend and history, Queen Susan of Narnia spent the first morning after her return to Carpetbaggers making lists. Lists of staff, their types, names, and duties. 32 of them so far, if one counted the talking mouse who had greeted her in the courtyard and volunteered to serve as the High King's armor-bearer. Susan had promised to consult with Peter and give him the temporary position of footman. Lists of food requirements, existing supplies, storage needs, and where it all could be obtained. This was mostly dictated by Panna and added to by Torvis. Lists of rooms, their capacity, and their furnishings. For where would all these people sleep, and what would they sleep on? Lists of clothing, what they had, what they needed, where it could be obtained, did they need to hire a tailor along with an armorer, and Susan wondered what the humans in other countries wore other than the tunics and mails she had seen on the Archenlanders and Telmarines. Lists of local Narnian leaders, their homes, their territories, and their history with the witch. This was begun by Susan, supplemented by Torvis, and likely to require perpetual updating. Lists of foreign nations, their inhabitants, and their attributes, whether they were friendly historically, did Narnia trade with them, who were their rulers. The last was necessarily left mostly blank, pending new intelligence. Paper surrounded her. Susan sat on a tall stool in the castle kitchen, her feet tucked up on the rungs, with paper spread across half the expanse of the enormous oaken table that took up much of the center of the kitchen. At the other end of the table, Panna stood on another stool and punched a small fist down into a crockery bowl of rising bread dough. The room was bright and cheery, lit by the double doors open into the kitchen gardens and full of the good smells of cookery. It wasn't Susan's first choice for a place to work. She had flour on her skirt, and Panna was prone to talk to her pots. But there was hardly any furniture in the castle at all. The only other table was on the balcony where they had had breakfast, and the wind would have carried half her papers away. She was just reviewing the staff lists and wondering, not for the first time, how they were going to feed and clothe all these people when Torvis came in through the garden doors. "Queen," he said with a shallow bow, "there are barracks inside the castle's outer walls. Think you the oath sworn could be lodged here?"
Could they? She asked. I don't see why they shouldn't. But where have you been sleeping since you arrived? You've been here for days, Torvis.
He shrugged, even in his diffidence, looking far more confident than his cousin Tumnus. His hair was darker than Tumnus's, and he was taller, and his bare chest, fawns were naked except in battle, which was something Susan would have to get used to, showed scars from sword, axe, and claw. He was altogether the most formidable fawn Susan had yet met. "It seemed inappropriate to enter without leave, good queen. We camped in the field, and were quite comfortable."
"The winter's coming, though," pointed out Panna,
who was now twisting long ropes of dough into fat braids on the floured table.
"It rains along the coast, I hear." "Then let's make sure that the barracks are fit for our guard,"
announced Susan, grateful for a reason to put down her pencil. She realized, when she stood up, that her back was stiff. She hadn't sat in one place for so long since she'd come to Narnia. Every day since had been full of action and movement, and she never lay awake at night, but dropped into slumber as easily as Lucy did. Leaving her paper stacked on the table, she led the way out of the kitchen. They emerged from the entry hall into a courtyard crowded with people, the very stones ringing with voices. Susan stopped and stared, and realized that the crowd was not so very large after all. It was most of the oath-sworn gathered into a rough circle. When she pushed forward between Bindle and the stag elm shadow, she saw what they were all looking at. Peter and Edmund were stripped to the waist and armed only with light wooden wands. They were sparring with Silversharp the centaur. She too had set aside her armor and her weapons and held only a shaft of wood about the height of a man, with no tip or edge. And yet she was easily holding off the persistent attacks of the two boys inside the confined space formed by the watching soldiers. Edmund leapt backwards just in time to avoid being in the knee, as Silversharp pivoted to parry a slash from Peter. "Oh!" someone said, and Susan looked to her right and saw Lucy watching with great excitement, her eyes shining. With Lucy stood Sallowpad on the back of a white tiger, whose name Susan didn't know. There was a shout of approval, and Peter looked back at the fight to see Peter grinning, and a red stripe across Silversharp's upper arm. "Well done, Pete!" cried Edmund, but almost before he got the words out, Silversharp's staff had leapt forward and rapped him in the chest, hard enough to send him stumbling backwards. He might have fallen, but Torvis stepped forward and caught him. "If that were a spear, Lord King, you would be dead," the centaur mare said dryly. She looked both unruffled and entirely cool, while both Peter and Edmund were sweating heavily and red in the face. "If that were a spear, weapons master," countered Peter, still gasping for breath, "you'd have had a dozen arrows in you before it left your hand." He gestured at the surrounding crowd, and Bindle giggled. There was a clatter nearby as another centaur approached, his hooves noisy on the stones of the courtyard. Windcaller looked about at the oath-sworn gathered around the two kings and raised his voice. "I do not remember granting liberty this morning when the gates stand unguarded and the armory is a jumbled mess. I'm sure if you all desire training so much, that can be arranged." His voice was full of a dry sarcasm that brought a flush even to Susan's cheek, and she was not under his command. The soldiers scattered, and in moments the courtyard was mostly empty but for the pendencies, Torvis, and the centaurs. Sallowpad gave a knowing click and flew up to the battlements. "Come to see us get humiliated?" Edmund asked Susan, grinning. She grinned back. Whatever had been eating him at breakfast seemed to have resolved itself. "No, true humiliation would be if Silversharp had taken you on while blindfolded. This, I think, is just normal humbling." "Queen Susan is very insightful," confirmed Silversharp.
Good kings, I suggest you rest in the heat of the day and drink plenty of water, and then return in late afternoon. We shall work on your strength and stamina.
She nodded gravely to Susan and Lucy, and then paced away, heading for the castle gate. One-Collar followed her.
Peter groaned and dug his head into a bucket nearby.
Lion's mane, that was embarrassing. She barely needed to move. Torvis handed Edmund his shirt, who mopped his face with it to Susan's exasperation. They desperately needed to get more clothes, or at this rate the boys would be in rags by the end of the week. When Peter had wiped the water from his face and handed the bucket to Edmund, Torvis said, Silversharp is an excellent soldier, my king, and I do not think she would have agreed to come if she didn't believe you worthy of her instruction. Edmund sniggered. In other words, bite shut your gob.
The barracks are over there, right, Torvis?
Asked Susan, and when he nodded, she continued on across the courtyard. Lucy followed after, but the boys went off into the gardens. Susan hoped this meant they would take the steep and narrow trail down to the beach and bathe before dinner. She didn't really want to be the mother figure for the kings and queens of Narnia, she thought, as she entered the closest barracks building, a broad and solid structure whose rear wall was the outside wall of the castle. She was not yet a grown woman herself, after all, and they did have a mother, even if she was very far away. Strongwind and Bacana were mothers, strong and fierce. Susan could see herself being like that not for a very long time. But her family did need someone to make sure they were fed and clothed and safe, and for all that Peter was a king and very brave and mostly sensible, Susan couldn't imagine he would enjoy counting up barrels of salted fish, as she had done with Panna this morning. Someday, she reckoned, they would go home, although the image of England had grown oddly blurred in her mind, as if it were a poorly focused photograph. She would like to be sure that when they had fulfilled this task that Aslan had set them to, for clearly being kings and queens of Narnia was less a reward than another greater challenge than the defeat of the witch, they would be safe and healthy and together, as she and Peter had promised their parents they would be. The inside of the barracks was less promising than the outside. There was little in the way of furniture, and one of the chimneys appeared to have a bird's nest in it. The glass in the windows was all gone, although the wooden shutters were still bolted to the walls. Susan threw open one set of windows, while Torvis opened the other, and Lucy rooted around in a pile of debris on the floor.
Oh, look, she said.
It was a small eating knife, with a worn horn handle and a brass seal on the pommel that looked like a weathered tree. The knife had clearly been well used, old long before it had been abandoned here among scraps of rotted leather and bits of broken wood. Lucy turned it over in her hand, and the sunlight reflected from the blade onto the walls and floor.
It's very old, she said thoughtfully. It must have been here when the witch first came. It probably belonged to one of the soldiers in the guard back then.
People lived here once, Susan thought. People who had eaten and slept and loved one another, and then died. Perhaps they had even died here in this castle, on these floors, and it was only Aslan or some aspect of the deep magic that had saved her from finding skeletons or worse in all those empty rooms. She shivered. Torvis touched her elbow. I'll send some people to clean the place out, Queen. We'll make it fine again, but we'll need to make another place for the centaurs. These rooms will not be large enough for them. You're right, said Susan, and they went out of the cold stone rooms into the bright castle courtyard. It was just noon, and the sky was cloudless, the day warm. Perhaps one of the last good days before the rains of autumn. The guards were back on duty at the gate. Susan could recognize Bendel from behind as the only dwarf with hair that short, and the white tiger sat on the opposite side of the gate, her head erect but her tail twitching as though she were watching a mouse hole. From the garden, Susan heard voices. Panna was arguing with Salopat about something. High overhead, a figure circled, probably a griffin, and Susan realized she would have another carnivore to feed soon. Narnia was Narnia. It held danger and wonder, death and glory, and while sometimes Susan might have to swim a mile underground, other times she might have to clean out old barracks. She rather hoped that in future she got more banquets and fewer battles. She dusted the cobwebs from her skirts and headed back to the great front doors, her steps quick and light on the cobbles. Peter and Edmund would train with Silversharp, and Lucy would run wild about the castle, charming everyone. And Susan? Susan had a castle to organize. They ate late that night, for Silversharp had kept Peter and Edmund past sunset, cantering beside them on a long loop through the open ground outside the castle. They ran and tripped and jumped when they didn't fall, and stumbled through fields and over fallen logs and across streams as the sunlight disappeared and the shadows deepened to blackness. Silversharp seemed made of steel rather than silver, her dry voice never pausing as she lectured them on logistics and strategy, on how vital it was to be able to move in the darkness, to know their own ground, to be able to keep going long after one wanted to stop. When she at last let them go, they stumbled across the field to the gates, past the campsites and fires of the Oathsworn, who greeted them with a mixture of friendly mockery and commiseration. "She'll have you up the cliffs next, King! You'll be wishing for the nighttime runs!" said one of the fawns, and a passing bear slapped Edmund on the back so hard he nearly fell over. At length they found the castle gates and staggered, footsore and trembling, up the stairs to the entry hall to discover Lucy, waiting for them, curled on the floor with a candle and a book in her hand. As Peter stopped in the doorway, Lucy leapt to her feet. "Oh, you're here! Finally! We've been waiting forever! Are you all right? Thomas said you would be late, but Susan wouldn't start supper without you." "Lies mine! I'm starving!" moaned Edmund, who was quite as filthy as Peter, although he hadn't fallen his outfit. But Peter shook his head. "Wash first, Ed, or we never will!" Lucy disappeared down the stairs to the kitchen, shouting, and Peter picked up Lucy's candle and led the way down the narrow side hall he discovered that morning. "What's this?" asked Edmund as they descended unsteadily a shallow flight of steps. Peter didn't answer. They were, he estimated, below the east tower and not far, in a direct line from the path down to the beach. The air was much warmer here. A wooden door stood ajar at the bottom of the stairs, and an odd damp smell met them. Peter stepped through the door, put his candle on a ledge at head height, and began to strip. Edmund followed him and gasped gratifyingly. "Where did this come from?" "No idea," said Peter, working on his boots. He suspected Carpetbaggers shared more than little of Narnia's magical awareness, and hadn't chosen to open the baths to them until they'd proven themselves first. Whatever the reason, he didn't care now that he had the cool cleansing tub and the enormous heated pool to soak in, large enough for a dozen humans to share, if they didn't mind bumping knees. The heated pool was like heaven for his battered bones. If Susan hadn't sent Torvis down to find them, Peter was quite sure he would have fallen asleep there and possibly drowned. Torvis also brought clothes. Somehow during the day, Susan had had their spare tunics cleaned, and his smelled of sun and dry grass as Peter pulled it over his head. "This way, Your Majesty," said Torvis when they re-emerged, and instead of leading them down to the kitchens, he took them up a flight of stairs and to a small room with a crackling fire. "About time!" cried Lucy. "We're starving!" "Like how we feel," grumbled Edmund, and staggered forward theatrically to collapse into a heap at Susan's feet. Peter glanced around and at length recognized the room. It was the chamber they had all slept in after the coronation party. Susan had piled the carpets together so they could serve as seats, if not actual chairs, having no backs, and 2 tree rounds were serving as a low table on which were several platters of hot food. "Sue, you're amazing," said Peter with a feeling, and Susan grinned at him as she spooned something red with meat and vegetables in it over what looked like plain rice.
"Panna's the amazing one,"
Susan said, and handed Peter the bowl.
"She brought boxes of cooking gear with her from Pattering Hill, including all these bowls, and by the time we arrived yesterday, she'd already been to Baruna at least once for supplies. She's the only reason we're not eating dandelion greens and charred fish again." Picking up one of the pottery cups, Peter sniffed and raised an eyebrow. "Where's the wine from? There wasn't any in the castle when we left." He lowered himself gingerly onto the carpets and took a cautious bite of the red stuff. It was still warm, pleasantly spicy, and chunky with bits of pork and a number of vegetables. It was even better than breakfast had been. Edmund shrugged, hunched over his own bowl, which Peter translated as, "I don't know, and I don't care. Don't you know I'm starving yet?" "Thomas, aren't you eating?"
asked Lucy suddenly, and Peter looked up to see the fawn retreating out the door. Torvis hesitated, looking at Lucy and Susan with a conflicted face, and then shook his head. "I have eaten already, Queen Lucy, but thank you for the offer. I will see you in the morning, no doubt." And he disappeared down the hallway.
"Oh,"
said Lucy, and looked a little crestfallen. Peter looked around and realized that this was the first time he'd been alone with only his siblings since Rhea had first come to them. It made the room a bit empty. "Seems odd to eat alone," said Edmund, serving himself a second helping of the rice. "Wasn't anyone else hungry?"
Susan toyed with her food a little. "They ate already," she said.
After a moment she went on.
"And besides, well, we're the kings and queens. We might like to eat in company, but it makes many of them feel uncomfortable."
The red stuff was suddenly less flavorful. Peter swallowed a mouthful and put his fork down. He wanted to protest, to complain, because he loved Narnia and Narnians and hated the thought of being set apart like that.
But he caught Lucy's eye and she looked unhappy, so instead he smiled at her.
"That's fair," he said, a little more forcefully than he intended. "Everyone wants some privacy now and then, after all. It'll work out."
"You think so?"
Lucy asked, and Peter said, "I'm sure of it." He almost believed himself. Susan served them all seconds, and Edmund thirds, and poured the wine, although she refused Lucy and Edmund a second cup to Edmund's dismay until Peter reminded him they were training again with Silversharp in the morning, and Edmund carefully switched to water. Susan had found her blue gown again, the one she had worn for the coronation, and she looked far more royal than the rest of them did, Peter had to admit. It was cozy with a fire, the open windows letting in the smell of the sea and the sound of the waves below. Peter pushed away his bowl at last and sank back onto the carpet, balancing his cup of wine on his stomach. He looked down at the wine, then around at his siblings. Susan was piling the bowls together in a neat stack. Edmund was considering a bruise on his knee where he had smacked it into a tree.
Lucy was idly tracing designs on the faded carpet.
"Well," Peter said, "what do you think now?" The bowls clanked as Susan piled them onto the empty serving platters.
"About what?"
"This!" Peter waved a hand at the castle around them, with its tiled floors and mysterious secrets, the hairstory hidden behind every door. "This job Aslan gave us. Think we can manage it?"
"Yes!" said Lucy with no hesitation. "Aslan wouldn't have given it to us if we couldn't."
Her face shone with her surety. Peter grinned and ruffled her hair, and then looked at Susan. Susan pursed her lips, smoothed the skirt of her dress, and then lifted her head proudly.
"Yes, I do think we can manage it. We have a lot to learn and not much to work with, but we do have something to offer. And Narnia needs us."
Peter couldn't help smiling. For all that she claimed to be the sensible one, the one who would stay at home and keep the fires burning, Susan would never turn down a challenge, especially when someone needed her. Aslan had known that, Peter was sure. He cocked an eyebrow at Edmund, who frowned and picked at a scab on his elbow. "It's not going to be easy," he said slowly, as if working it out as he spoke. "Silversharp isn't training us so hard just for the fun of it. We've got more trouble ahead, I can tell that much. Those mercenaries. I think Telmar will be a problem for a long while. And there's likely more besides that we don't know about." Edmund looked up at Susan sharply. "Aunt Sue, I think you'd better come out with us tomorrow."
Susan frowned. "But we've got plenty of archers now."
"No, Ed's right," interrupted Peter, pushing himself upright. "You and Lucy both should be training as well. We don't know what's coming,
and I promise to keep you safe," he thought, but didn't say it.
"It's better to be prepared, just in case."
Susan said, "There's other kinds of training too," and looked at Lucy. "We should all be in school by now if we were still in England." "But there aren't any schools,"
protested Lucy, seeing where this was going. Edmund laughed. "No, but we're surrounded by the smartest people in Narnia. You think you couldn't learn anything from Rhea, or Torvis, or Salopad? We need to know Narnia's history and geography, and politics. And agriculture, money-making, road-building, forestry, weaving, smithing, fishing, hunting, and shipbuilding," continued Peter, and dropped his head back with a groan to stare at the shadowy ceiling. There was so much to do. But oddly, he wasn't afraid of it. Aslan had brought them to Narnia, sure they had the skills to succeed, and he had sent them help. Rhea and Salopad, Silversharp and Windcaller, Broadclaw and Torvis. They held Narnia now, or maybe they didn't hold it, but they had touched it and started to learn it, and it had begun to learn them. They knew it now, the real Narnia, not the shallow image of it that had formed during the struggle with the witch, and that had danced to the mer people singing during the coronation party. That had been a fairy tale country, and it had disappeared with the magic when the party was over. The real Narnia was thigh-deep in cold water underground, picking brimbleberries and planting grapevines, shearing sheep in the summer heat on the northern hills, cutting sheaves of corn with a stone knife and grinding the grain by hand, poling rafts loaded with supplies down a flood-swollen river, hunting elk over the snow in the western mountains, hammering out fine silver-chased mail in a sweltering forge. It was Bindle's shaved face and Fractionist's tortured memories, Tumnus's shame and Bruno's grandstanding, Pecana's strength and Ponsonby's generosity, and Rhea's steadfast loyalty. He didn't know how to say any of that, so instead he sat up and put out his hands. They all linked hands together with an odd ritual solemnity. The fire was dying and the light flickered across his siblings' faces, making them look by turns older and younger, pleased and worried, resolved and joyful. But their eyes were shining. "I think," Peter said, looking down at the kings and queens of Narnia, "this is going to be the best adventure ever!" And that is the end of this story, which is just one of the many adventures the Pevensies had in their time as kings and queens of Narnia. If you read the other Narnia books, you know that they went on to be Narnia's most famous and beloved rulers, and under their guidance, Narnia became strong and prosperous again. But between this adventure I have shared with you, and their final return to England after they'd grown to be wise and skillful rulers, there must indeed be many more stories to tell. End of Carpetbaggers by Kofax. If you enjoyed this recording, feel free to leave a comment below or a review at the original story from the link in the descriptions. Also, please like and subscribe for more great content published every day. Thank you for listening.